Today is Transfiguration Sunday in terms of the church's liturgical calendar. Transfiguration Sunday is the last Sunday of the season of Epiphany. And Epiphany is the season that we've been in since the end of Christmastide. I know you all have been marking these days down on your calendar as we've gone along, but it's one of the ways that the church seeks to tell the story of Jesus throughout the year. During the season of Epiphany, we focus on readings that help us declare and proclaim to the world who Jesus Christ is. We have the appearance of the Magi who come and represent all the nations coming to adore and give honor to Jesus. We have the stories of Jesus' baptism, where Jesus, as he comes up from the waters, hears the voice from heaven declare, "This is my son, the beloved. You are my son, the beloved." And then other stories, as we've been in Mark's gospel so far this year, you may remember some of the stories where spirits or demons have yelled out on different occasions when they confront Jesus, "We know who you are. We know who you are, the Holy One of God. What have you to do with us?" But in the season of Epiphany, the church has sought through its use of scripture passages and worship to say to the world who we believe Jesus Christ is. And we come to today, Transfiguration Sunday, and it's sort of the hinge point between Epiphany and now as we move next Sunday into the season of Lent. The central passage for Transfiguration Sunday is always usually the story of the Transfiguration, as we find it in one of the different Gospels. It's a story, again, somewhat clouded in mystery, but which has at its core, as its center, this revelation of who Jesus Christ is. But it also happens in between some very difficult circumstances. In the context of the passage today, just before this is the event when Jesus tells his disciples the first passion prediction, that he's going to go to Jerusalem and be killed and after 3 days rise again. And you remember how Peter objects to that, and Jesus then turns and rebukes Peter and says, "Get behind him, Satan." And then we have the famous passage of the nature of discipleship. "Anybody who would be my disciple, let them pick up their cross and follow me." And this then flows right into the experience 6 days later of the Transfiguration. So we have kind of this tension going on as we're beginning to move forward into the story of the revelation of who Jesus is and what that is going to mean for our lives. How are we going to be called to live out our lives of discipleship in light of who we know Jesus to be? And this is what brings us to the text today. It also ties in with the Old Testament lesson Helen read, which is a story, kind of a transfer of leadership from the prophet Elijah to the prophet Elisha, and going back and forth. And then around the story of Transfiguration, the figure of Elijah appears again. But it continues to tie together of who is Christ and what does his identity mean for us and the way we live out our lives of discipleship. So beginning to read in Mark chapter 9, beginning in verse 2. "6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, 'Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah.' He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice, 'This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him.' Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. As they were coming down from the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen, till after the Son of Man had risen from the dead." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O God, who art our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. One moment as I transfigure. I got so excited about it, I forgot to bring my sermon up here with me. So I thought when I go back, who knows what I would have been preaching on otherwise. I like movies that have closing subtitles that tell the rest of the story about the major characters or events which have just taken place in a movie. Sometimes these subtitles are called title cards or end titles. And they describe a moment which happens later in the life of the characters of the movie, or they make some kind of historical reference which just fills out the picture for you. To me, it always feels like you're getting a whole nother story, a whole additional layer just after you've enjoyed the wonderful story of the movie itself. Now, here are some ones that you may remember. At the end of the movie, the King's Speech, the title card read, King George VI made Lionel Logue a commander of the Royal Victorian Order in 1944, the only order of chivalry that specifically rewards acts of personal service to the monarch. And at the end of the movie, Catch Me If You Can, a movie which starred Tom Hanks and Leonardo DiCaprio, who played Frank Abagnale, the notorious imposter and counterfeiter, the title card read, Frank Abagnale Jr. has helped the FBI capture some of the world's most elusive check forgers and counterfeiters. Frank has also designed secure checks that many banks use today. Do y'all remember that at the end of that movie? I thought that was fascinating. Title cards don't always have to be true either. Maybe one of the most famously funny title cards at the end of the movie said simply, Senator and Mrs. John Blutarski, Washington, D.C. Some of you obviously remember that movie. Do you remember that movie? It was from Animal House, and it ran under the picture of John Belushi, who played that crazy college fraternity character, Bluto. I never believed that, but it was a sure funny end title there. Some end titles are extremely moving and powerful. At the end of Schindler's List, the movie about the German businessman Oskar Schindler's efforts to save and imprison Jews during the Holocaust, the final title card read, there are fewer than 4,000 Jews alive in Poland today. There are more than 6,000 descendants of the Schindler Jews. It just made chills go up and down your arms when you read that at the end of that movie. Well, earlier this week, the Christian Education Committee was meeting, and Ann Gardape was telling us how the Park Lake Page Turners, a book club here at Park Lake, which just celebrated 10 years of being together, meeting together and reading together. And if you were here, I think I saw you earlier, congratulations and thank you for the leadership you've given to that book club. But Ann was sharing with the committee how the book club, Park Lake Page Turners, had just read the book Hidden Figures. And that's the book that the popular movie of the same name was based on. And Ann said that a number of the members of the group of the Page Turners stayed after they talked about the book at the Fisher's house. They stayed and then watched the movie Hidden Figures together. And if you haven't seen that movie or if you haven't read that book, you know that this is the story of three African-American women, Katherine Johnson and Dorothy Vaughan and Mary Jackson, who played an important role in the early space race and the Mercury mission. And I guess the title Hidden Figures is kind of a nuance between the hiddenness of the roles that they were playing and the roles which were not known, especially the role of African American women in the space program, as well as maybe the hiddenness of the mathematical figures which they were working on and figuring out to help bring the astronauts home from their orbits. But as Ann was talking to us about it, it reminded me that I did not see the movie in the theater. I saw it on an airplane ride from New York City back to Orlando. And unfortunately, the flight just wasn't quite long enough, or else I just didn't start the movie until too late after the flight had started. So as we got toward the end of the movie, as I was just totally engrossed in it, the pilot came on the intercom and said that we were about to land, which of course interrupted the movie. You couldn't hear anything and you're wondering what's going on. And then even as the plane landed and the movie was still showing, I hadn't quite finished yet. I was about 3 or 4 minutes behind everybody else. I looked up and I could see the movie on the backs of other chairs as it was playing, and I could see those end title credits rolling up. And I was trying to look around even after the plane landed and people were getting up out of their seats. It was still going on my screen, but I knew the people to my left on the inside were not going to sit there as I watched the rest of the movie as they were trying to get out into the aisle and get there. So there I was with a few minutes to go, and I couldn't tell what was happening at the end of the movie. Everybody else had the end of it, but they were all taking off, and I had to get up and do the same. It was just so frustrating. It just drove me crazy. So of course, after we got back home, I went online to read about the life stories of these three women in the movie and to find out what happened to them. But just that little delay between getting off the plane and then going back home, it just changed everything. And it wasn't the same. Now, I learned by reading that Katherine Johnson, an honored mathematician, she goes on to work for the Apollo and the Space Shuttle program and then was eventually honored with a Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2015. And I learned that Dorothy Vaughan was promoted to supervising manager of the computer programming department. And I learned that Mary Jackson eventually earned her engineering degree, one of the first African American women in NASA to earn an engineering degree. But there was something that I had lost. I had been denied that sort of magical moment when you are still so enraptured in the film that when the end title cards run, it's like you can just see into the future, like something's being revealed for you. At the end of the film, for a few brief seconds, as those title cards roll, it always feels to me like you're still in relationship with the characters whose lives are now being fully revealed to you. You can see ahead. You can see ahead just for a moment to the way everything is going to turn out. And I always find that to be a very satisfying feeling, a moment of contentment to kind of sit back and let go of a big breath, knowing how it all turns out. I think the story of the Transfiguration is like that kind of moment. For a few brief seconds or minutes or whatever, Peter and James and John, they're so encaptured in something that is happening. Whatever it is that is going on up there on that mountain, they're encaptured in it. And they can see who Jesus is. And they can see in a way that they've never been able to see before. Even though up to this point they've had all kinds of hints and clues and insights, and it may be hard to understand how it is they couldn't know what's going on yet. To have seen him do all these different miracles, to have seen him cast out various spirits and demons, to see him stilling the waters of a storm, to see him bring a young girl back to life and yet not fully know, but they don't. Still, here they are in a moment on a mountain, and suddenly they're encaptured in something that just opens their eyes to what it's all about. A moment when the reality of Jesus that underlies everything else that they've experienced up to this point. A moment in which is revealed the reality of who Jesus will be in the days ahead, and the truth about Jesus that will finally be apparent in all eternity. Something like that seems to be going on there on the Mount of Transfiguration. What kind of word, what word would you use to describe such a moment? I went to dictionary.com to try and find some words. I kept thinking that liminal would be a good word for this. It's a liminal experience. And the dictionary.com says that luminol is really just a form of phenobarbital. Somehow or another comes from that. So I thought, how did that get in my head? But it still sounds right to me. Luminol, having to do with light shining forth. Or maybe liminal, something that suggests being at the threshold of experience, at the edge of something bigger that is being made known. Or think about the word luminary, which suggests a celestial body or object. It gives light. And there is so much light in this scene. There are objects there on the Mount of Transfiguration which seem to be showing and saying and demonstrating something else. Would you call it luminous? Would you call it transparent? What word would you use to describe this experience of Peter and James and John and what they witnessed there on the Mount of Transfiguration? Whatever word you would use to describe it. It's moments like that that we long for in our lives. To be able to see as we've never seen before, to be able to know as we've never understood before, to be able to believe as we've never believed before, to just have a sense of how things will ultimately and finally turn out, and to know the way ahead for us. Have you ever had any moments like that? Any luminal moments? Earlier this week, I was with some friends over in Tampa, and one of the friends, Richard Boyce, is the dean of Union Seminary's Extension Campus in Charlotte. And one of the things that is done when we gather there as friends is they just talk about their families and things that are going on. And Richard shared that not too long ago, about 2 years ago, his father died, and we knew that, but it also happened right at the same time that his wife was experiencing a huge medical crisis. She had an aneurysm which ruptured in her stomach. So Richard found himself at the hospital at the same time with his father on one floor struggling and his wife on another floor struggling and going back and forth and just being torn between the two. His father hadn't been well for some time. He had suffered from a poor heart, and the doctors were trying all kinds of new things they thought would help him. They'd even come to believe that it would be a good candidate for a new kind of valve that might help him out and lengthen his life a little bit longer. But as so many of you know, dealing with things like that involves invasive kind of procedures, and they had to try and keep putting a feeding tube down his father's throat, which they kept having difficulty doing, until finally one time Richard came down from seeing his wife and saw his dad, and his dad was sitting there with his arms crossed. His dad, who was a retired Presbyterian minister and great saint of the church, and his dad said to Richard, God's told me that there's a short way home for me and a long way home for me. I've chosen the short way. And in saying that, Richard knew he had made a decision about not wanting to have to go through any more procedures. And he died just a few days later. But as Richard described it, and as he described his dad's decision and his dad's confidence and assurance and comfort, maybe even the light coming from his dad, as he talked about the 2 ways home that God was showing him and the choice he was going to take, it became kind of a luminous, luminary moment for all of us. And cast light on all the things we talked about together for the rest of the week. Have you ever had moments like that? I remember some of the liminal moments or luminary moments that we've all experienced around the mission fair, which has been an important part of the life of this church for 16 and 17 years now. Do you remember one of the first mission fairs, a man named Hawk? Hawk was all we knew to call him by, but we had invited him to come speak at our mission fair because he lived over at the Christian Service Center in the Fresh Start program. But his job was also to be the job of keeping order at Daily Bread. And he was a big, rough, harsh-looking African-American man. And when you were over there listening to him instruct the people at Daily Bread, you knew he had things in control and you didn't want to cross him. But when Hawk said do this, you did that. Or when Hawk said that, he came and spoke to us at the mission fair, this time dressed up in a fine suit and sharing with us the story of his life and how he had gotten there and what it meant for him to have a place there to live. And as he talked, he began to cry, and it became a liminal moment for us. Or you remember when Paul Nashangwa spoke at the mission fair for the first time before we had met his wife, and he shared the story of how as a young man he had been taken to see the Jesus film in Africa and how it become the point of his conversion. But the way that he was able to go was because a man whom he had stolen bread from, who had got him and said, "Didn't you steal this bread from me?" And after Paul had to acknowledge it, the man said, "Still, I forgive you," and gave him a $1 coin, which was the amount of admission price to go and get to see the movie. And as Paul talked to us, he held up that coin and he said, this is the cost of my salvation? I just remember that as a luminal moment. We've asked Joel Hunter, and he has accepted to come be the Sunday speaker at our mission fair. And it's a wonderful story how we came up with Dr. Hunter to come be our speaker. We were sitting in a mission fair committee meeting a number of weeks ago, and we were talking about what a theme for us might be. And Evie Park said, "I think we need to focus on peace. There seems to be so much division, so much strife, so much conflict in our lives, in our country, around the world. Maybe it would be good for us to focus on peace." And Evie is such a peaceful person, it sounds like a word from on high. And so we took that as a wonderful idea of a theme. What can we find out about God's mission of peace in the world? And then we said, well, who in the world can we get to come speak on peace? And Helen suggested, let's ask Joel Hunter. Just sounded like a throwaway line. He would never come except speaking here. Recently retired from being the head pastor at Northland Distributed Church. Why would we ask Joel Hunter? Well, he's well known maybe, but he's also begun a work called Community Resources Network, where he's trying to get every church together and pool their resources and pool their efforts and pool their knowledge on ways that are helping homeless people who come to churches. And that seemed like a good act of peace for us to hear about from Joel. But the real story underlying Helen's suggestion was that she and I had gone to Northland about a year ago to see a program that was taking place there while Joel was still the lead pastor. He had sponsored a program with an organization called the Reform Project. And the Reform Project is an organization that brings LGBTQ individuals together into conservative evangelical churches and says, let's at least have conversations around these issues. And they try to have civil conversations, and that was taking place there in the Northland Sanctuary one evening. And in the midst of the conversation that was going on amongst the panel leaders, representatives from both sides, part of which Joel was leading, he said something which was almost a throwaway line about the way people behave when they're in middle school. Who can understand what's going through the mind of a middle school? But one of the young women on the panel suddenly tensed up when he said it. And you could tell that it hurt her, that it was something she had experienced in life. It was palpable feeling that in the room. And we didn't exactly know what was going to happen, but all of a sudden, Joel Hunter said, stop. And he brought the whole proceedings to a conclusion. He just said, stop. And he turned and looked at the woman. He said, I can tell. I realize that I've hurt you. And I'm sorry. I'm not sure what it was I said, but I don't want to go any further until you know that I had no intention of hurting you or demeaning you or saying something against you. It was a moment of peace. It was a luminal moment for us, a liminal moment for us, and a luminary moment. You ever had any moments like that? They go a long way in helping you to see what's ahead. I gave devotions at the Mayflower Retirement Center on Wednesday. And since I was coming back from Tampa and having been over there, I was just going to rehash one of the sermons that I had given here at Park Lake earlier in the winter. And it was a sermon where I was talking about Jesus' call to follow. And I decided I would go talk to the residents there about Jesus saying, follow me, and them dropping everything and following them. And if you remember that sermon, I used an illustration from a book I've read that has a very powerful illustration to me, but apparently is difficult to translate to others as I've talked about it. But I was still going to try and hammer away at it with the folks there in the Mayflower Retirement Center. And I was doing that, talking about following me, trying to use that illustration in the first group that I spoke to, and realizing that it was just not going anywhere. Not only was the illustration, again, hard to explain, but as I looked at the people there, it seemed that they were saying to me, follow me? Where? Where in the world am I going to follow? By leaving my retirement center? So I was quickly trying to refashion what I was trying to say. When you speak at the Mayflower, you start with one group and then go to the next group, and the next group was a group of assisted living people. And as I stood before them preparing and going through my mind, what in the world can I say to them about follow me? I realized that I had to come up with something quick. What in the world did I have to say about following them where they currently were? But we were singing the hymn, Be Still My Soul. And they were loving singing that hymn. And I was listening to the verses. The third verse says, Be still my soul, when dearest friends depart, and all is darkened in the veil of tears, then shalt thou better know his love, his heart, who comes to soothe thy sorrow and thy fears. Be still my soul, thy Jesus can repay, from his own fullness all he takes away. And as we were singing that, I suddenly remembered that Lois and Shirley had told me as we walked from one place to the other about 12 of the residents, friends, who had just died within the past 2 weeks at the Mayflower. And I was looking at them as they were singing that, listening to the words of Jesus in the song. And then we sang the fourth verse, Be still my soul, the hour is hastening on, when we shall be forever with the Lord, when disappointment, grief, and fear are gone, sorrow forgot, love's purest joys restored. Be still my soul, when change and tears are past, all safe and blessed, we shall meet at last. And then we just talked about what it meant for them to follow Jesus, where they were, thinking about their friends, looking ahead. And it was one of those moments. I know one pastor who has said, I have learned through all these years to piece together a little bit of faith to live by. I just make snippets of things. The question of a child, a burst of laughter, a walk to the mailbox, struggling with a text, a little prayer in the morning, conversation with a friend, an evening meal, coming by the chapel when someone is rehearsing on the organ, listening to the choralers practice down the hall as I try to think. I just kind of piece it together, really. A whisper here, an aroma there, an imitation there. And it's enough to live by. Enough to be reminded of how we are called to live. Enough to be reminded of Jesus' promise of who we will be and who we can be. Enough to be transfigured and see things for how they really are for a moment. Amen.